that brings us probably to our third team after closing on mergers and acquisitions. And we'd like to spend a little bit of time talking about regulations. I mean, regulations in the water industry are everywhere. They are, present for almost anyone involved, whether on the industrial, municipal side. So I think it's worth to touch on them. And my first question will go to you, Bill, because it's really market driven, and there's a lot of contaminants that are regulated in the water industry. But lately, it seems that all we can hear about, at least in the mainstream media, not necessarily the water related medias, but the mainstream medias, is PFAS, PFAS, PFAS. Everybody talks about PFAS in the United States, at least. What is PFAS? Is that a market to pursue? It's definitely a market to watch. Is it to pursue? And what is creating that sudden attention to one particular contaminant when we know very well that there's so many out there that are also important?
Okay, so PFAS is definitely something to watch. It's an emerging contaminant. I'm not going to stretch my scientific knowledge by explaining too much about the compounds behind it, but it's a byproduct of a lot of industrial processes that were used for decades in the U.S., particularly with Teflon related products. It was also in firefighting foam. So it's something that, for better or worse, it's definitely for worse, is widespread across groundwater in North America, and probably we'll see it in a lot of other markets as well as the awareness starts to rise. But where we are, and you referenced regulation early on, where we struggle now, there is a lot of recognition of the problem, but there are not uniform standards in place about what is the acceptable level of PFAS in water, and what standard then do utilities or industrial users have to reach in removing PFAS from a water supply. So it's definitely something to watch. There will be growth here, but it's not likely to be this tsunami that hits us soon of lots of spending on it. It's likely to take time for this to really hit its peak. So and as you remove it, it also it raises the question, and maybe I'm hoping Tom can speak to this a little, of what you then do with the contaminants once you've removed them, because now all you've done is concentrate them either in a brine or in solids that also need to be safely disposed of. So this is one of the big trends that are coming. That's coming. Other scare, in the past we've seen scares around things like arsenic, around cryptosporidium. They've generally been regional in nature. I think what we're seeing with PFAS is unique because it is really widespread, and it's being regulated on that state by state level, which makes it uneven.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, so curious to hear what you have to say, Tom, on that, and whether PFAS is treatable, and can we treat it? Can we destroy it? Those are two different things. And then, Tom, if you could also comment on not just about PFAS, but about other contaminants. What comes first? Do you see regulations being implemented and then technologies trying to go after the regulatory environment? Or do you see technologies being invented, and once they exist, then the regulators bring in regulations? What comes first, technology or regulations?
Well, it's a good question, and the clear answer is it depends. But it does, because there are a lot of examples of technologies that are developed to address regulations, and PFAS is something that is certainly a lightning rod right now. Everybody hears about it, and one of the problems with it is regulations were put in place before we had any real idea that what the problems can be, and it's suspected of many things, but some of the studies that have been done, or the only large-scale studies that have been done, show that it may contribute to increasing cholesterol levels or incidence of thyroid problems. But despite the fact that it's obviously a bad actor and a forever chemical, as they say, it's I don't believe it's been proven to be a carcinogen, and they're still trying to establish what is the maximum accepted level. And the EPA has put a number out there, and this requires people who are a little bit more familiar with all the terminology than I am, but an action level and a reporting level, at which if you get above that level, you have to report it and decision has to be made what should be done or how it should be treated. But those levels, one of the issues is it's 70 parts per trillion for a sum of a number of different constituents that are all classified as PFAS. Now, that's a number that is very difficult to measure. And what has happened is some states, and California for one, has made it much more strict, almost by an order of magnitude more strict than what the EPA has already mentioned. And the EPA is now in an effort that I understand could take another year or two before they decide what is the level. So you've got these requirements in place that I mean, nobody wants to drink water with PFAS in it. It sounds bad, but how bad is and at what level is yet to be determined. So it's a tough issue. There are other issues where or other situations where regulatory requirements were put in place. For instance, in California with seawater desalination, there was a technology that was mentioned as the preferred technology for seawater filtration prior to the desalination process. However, the first plant that tried to move forward on that basis, an expert panel said it was economically and technically infeasible to even implement it. Yet it's institutionalized in the California Ocean Plan. There are other examples. We talked about reuse. There are some examples in the pre-treatment for reuse. So it's a tough situation, and there's no easy answer. But I mean, that's part of what makes our industry so interesting. I will say this about PFAS, and in final comment on it, because Bill touched on it, and that is, what do you do with it when you get it out? Well, some plants, there are some significant sized plants that are removing PFAS from the drinking water supply, but then they take the concentrate and they dump it downstream in the same river that they drew the water out to begin with. But it's discharged downstream where there's no further potable water withdrawals. So it's thought that it's, by the time it gets to the sea, it's diluted, and rightfully so. I mean, it sounds like a good, it sounds like a reasonable approach when you consider the minute levels we're talking about. But you don't always have a river with nobody downstream of you. So what you do with it is then you figure out a way to either put it somewhere where it'll be safe forever, or destruct it. And there are a number of technologies that are being evaluated right now. There's none that are yet commercial, and they all are fairly energy intensive, but they're designed to destruct it, to take these chemicals and destroy them. So we're looking at there are many technologies where some of which they're looking at treating them in the aquifer itself before they right in place or in situ. So a lot of it's probably more than you wanted to know about it for this particular forum, but it's a complicated issue.
Definitely is. So maybe if we continue our regulations panel for with a question to Deborah, I think Tom's comments clearly made everyone realize how complex a PFAS and a new contaminant problem can be, and I think from an investment standpoint, it seems that there's a lot of interest around modern issues, right? PFAS is very modern, it's very current. But what about investments in companies that are focusing on older regulatory problems, such as disinfection byproducts, viruses, phosphorus, nitrates? I mean, there's not a single wastewater project that goes in the country right now that doesn't have some level of phosphorus and nitrate, requirements for removal. Do you feel that those investments that are focusing on older regulatory problems are getting the same level of attention from the investment community as the newer problems? And why? If not, why?
I actually think that probably the older issues are getting more attention from investors. And the reason I say that is because investors listen to all the, the chatter that goes on, whether it's around PFAS. I can remember when there was a lot of chatter around treating ballast water from ships. They listen to that stuff, but investors hate uncertainty. Bill talked about this, Tom talked about this. There's so much complexity and uncertainty around some of these newer regulations and newer technologies to meet the standards of the newer regulations. Investors, frankly, don't have a lot of appetite for that kind of risk and uncertainty. And what they want is a large market that's clearly where the regulations are set, where there's a lot of, frankly, political and funding support. And so therefore a market is created where money will be spent and technologies can be deployed profitably. So nutrient management is one area where I think that's starting to be the case. It wasn't early on, but as you said, wastewater treatment plants are now all having to consider the nutrients, particularly phosphorus and nitrogen. And what that means is that there's a clear spending pattern. And the reason that we have that now is because the regulations have been around for a while. And I think most fundamentally, there's a lot of political support for it. If you think about the algae blooms that have happened in everywhere from the Great Lakes to Florida to the Chesapeake Bay, all kinds of places around the country, that there's a lot of political support for fixing that, and therefore the dischargers of those nutrients are going to have to treat them. Those are the kinds of markets I think that investors like, ones that they know that they can count on.
Mm-hmm. Established markets with a long-term visibility that they're gonna be there to stay. That's good.
That's
Thank
right.
you, Deborah. And Fred, if you'd like to maybe close the discussion on regulations and bring it into the H2O perspective, is H2O a company that pursues regulatory driven markets, and maybe on PFAS, right? Do you have any technologies in the portfolio right now that can address the PFAS issue?
Well, we want to be careful. I mean, to Deborah's point, I mean, investors hate uncertainty. So we want to be an early adopter, or at least, be interested in bringing new technologies to the market. But we saw also through our past experience that, that there's a point where there's no real benefit of trying to be the first, because the water industry is a slow-moving industry, and regulation takes time. I mean, you need to keep in mind that it's only in 2001 that finally, the regulations now have said it clear and loud that we cannot add chlorine without filtering and removing organics to water because it creates byproducts. But this was only in 2000. But it took several years to develop that and come up with the common strategy in terms of regulations. I think there's still a lot to be done around PFAS along the emerging compounds. However, what we have built as H2O Innovation as a platform, because we're open source designer and membrane integrators, I think we can tremendously benefit and adapt ourselves in the most efficient and rapid way. In a sense that because we're not necessarily making the membranes itself, but integrating them, and because we have our knowledge and expertise around membrane filtration, we can rapidly identify the right membranes. One, it will be recognized for its benefits and apply it to the markets in the most efficient manner. And this is what H2O has been doing over the last years and will continue to do. We have done some projects where PFAS was removed and had to be removed, and we're certainly going to do it. Now, the trends, however, are not necessarily fully clear on how and to what level it should be treated. So right now it's kind of we're positioning ourselves. Our expertise around membrane filtration is positioning us in a far front. However, we don't want to be too fast to only focus on that market.